This is Robin Koerner, and I am speaking to Andrew Yang, presidential candidate for 2020, running with the D after his name. Andrew, thank you for being on the show with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Robin. I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, you are the first presidential candidate of this 2020 cycle that I've spoken to. Hopefully not the last, but I'm thrilled to be starting with you because I've been looking at some of your stuff, some of the interviews you've done, your website, and there's lots of genuinely interesting ideas that I'm hearing from you. And as I mentioned to you before we hit record here, you don't seem to be in one of the boring ideological boxes that so many of our politicians are in right now in the United States. So, that's exciting for me. So, now, I also said to you before I hit record that I wasn't going to just go over the same things that everybody else is going over with you and ask you all the same questions. But the first one will be a common question, which is, give us the one-paragraph bio of Andrew Yang.
Sure. I'm a serial entrepreneur and problem solver. I spent the last 6.5 years helping create several thousand jobs in Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, Birmingham. And I'm convinced that we're in the midst of the greatest economic and technological transformation in the history of the country. The reason why Donald Trump's our president today is because we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in the swing states. So imagine being the guy who's getting accolades and medals for creating thousands of jobs and realizing that you're pouring water into a bathtub that has a giant hole ripped in the bottom. And that's really my narrative in a nutshell, which is that I'm the guy who spent 6.5 years helping create thousands of jobs around the United States.
So let me ask, why are you running with that D after your name? What's your relationship with the Democratic Party or philosophy?
It's an interesting question. I am sure that running as a Democrat is the right thing to do on multiple levels. One is that the mechanics of running for president necessitate that you run as someone who's part of one of the major parties, unless you're a billionaire and can fund a third party move that's probably just going to be doomed to fail anyway. and so the American political system necessitates that you run as either Democrat or Republican. And I line up with the Democrats in most every policy sense around things like reproductive rights and, some of the other social issues like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, rights and everything else. And so running as a Democrat was a very natural decision for me. I was an honorary ambassador in the Obama White House, and so I have many Democrat friends.
Okay, so you're somewhat connected in the party then at quite a high level.
Yeah, I have many friends in the Democratic Party as well. So I'm certainly much more connected among Democrats than I am among Republicans.
All right, well, that makes sense. So since you're running for president, what do you see as the role of the president fundamentally? And I should point out that I'm sitting here with the Constitution behind me. So the right answer is actually on the wall behind me. But what do you feel is the role of the president?
Well, it's really funny you asked that, Robin, because I think the role of the president has morphed over time, and it's just grown and become this kind of massive set of responsibilities that are well beyond what was originally intended. So as one example, I heard that there was a period when the president would just walk into a room and then everyone would not notice that he was there until someone said, you know what, that's unacceptable. We have to play this song every time you walk into a room. And so you imagine that happening thousands of times in different ways, where the president went from being in many ways like a first among equals in a relatively egalitarian society that had consciously eschewed royalty, to now it's become this giant potentate ceremonial figure, as well as the person who's meant to execute the laws of the country, which is the original intent. And so one of my goals actually is to try and make the presidency itself more manageable. And so one of the ideas I've had is to appoint a head of the culture who will handle pardoning turkeys and congratulating sports teams and doing things that strike me as not really great uses of time. And so I would appoint either Oprah or The Rock or Joe Rogan, and then they would just be there and do the ceremonial things, and then everyone would win because most Americans would rather meet them than me anyway, and so I'd be doing something else, and we'll see what else we can process out. There are a few things we could do that I think would simplify the job of the president.
Yeah, as a Brit by birth, I come from a land with a constitutional monarchy, and it is a shame to me that the American president signs more executive orders than all the kings of England going back for 400 years. We have a ceremonial monarch, and we keep it separate from politics, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. But here, it's almost like you vote for a king for 4 or 8 years, and that is problematic. So your point is well taken. Now, you've got some really, big, interesting ideas on your website that you're running on, that you're putting out front and center. I would like to kind of prime you into them by asking you to tell me about 2 things: citizens as shareholders and bad numbers. And they're kind of related. So talk to me about either or both.
Yeah, so as you know, Robin, one of my key ideas is that America should have a dividend for all citizens of $1,000 a month called the Freedom Dividend. And this has been an idea that's been with us since the founding of the country. Thomas Paine was for it originally, and then Martin Luther King was for it, Milton Friedman was for it. It passed the House of Representatives twice in 1971 under Nixon, and then Alaska adopted it 37 years ago. So right now, American citizens feel like our democracy has been lost to us because now it's just been overrun by money, and you have these giant moneyed interests that have taken control of the whole apparatus. And so one way to counterbalance that is to make us, the citizens, the owners and shareholders and beneficiaries of our society again. And the best way to do that would be to declare a dividend. In terms of bad numbers, right now we're being guided by GDP and stock market prices and headline unemployment, all of which are deeply flawed and problematic and misleading, where GDP is at record highs, but also at record highs are suicides, drug overdoses, mental health problems. And the American life expectancy has declined for the last 3 years because of a surge in deaths of despair. The last time the American life expectancy declined for 3 years in a row was the Spanish flu of 1918. So we're actually in Spanish flu territory. And so if you rely upon GDP as your guidepost, then you think everything's going great. But if you rely upon more basic human measurements like how long we're living, how healthy we are, how mentally healthy we are, how free of drugs we are falling apart. So we are using the wrong numbers, and we need to start using the right ones to see how we're doing and make progress.
Now, one of the things that seems to be a fundamental flaw of pretty much everything the government does today is it passes a law, and obviously a law stands in perpetuity unless somebody comes and repeals it or revokes it. And they do so without mention of success or failure metrics. There's no sunsetting of anything based on success or failure. With particular reference to your Freedom Dividend, which is akin to what most people know as a universal basic income, which I know you want to set at $1,000 a month. What would be the success and failure metrics? How would you know this has helped to make the changes you want to see in American society?
Well, if you look at the Alaska Petroleum Dividend, it's created thousands of jobs, made children healthier, decreased income inequality, and it's wildly popular in a deeply conservative state. So if you saw those things happen in a population and everyone was excited about the dividend, then you'd probably think it was successful. And certainly where similar things have been implemented in other locations, you see an increase in physical health, nutrition, mental health, graduation rates, trust in others, relationships, like everything gets better. But this is a democracy, and so you'd have to rely upon people's desires and affirmations. And so if we do it and everyone loves it, then it's probably working.
Now that's interesting. I'm wondering now if that's true. I noticed on your website, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I saw this on your website, that that you promote Medicare for all, full single-payer health. Is that right? Yeah,
that's right. We need to have a robust public option in the U.S. Because right now we're spending twice as much as other countries to worse results. And it's breaking the backs of many families and businesses every day.
Okay, so again, coming from Britain, not only do we have a monarchy, we have the another institution, which is the only institution more popular than the monarchy in Britain, which is the National Health Service. And I believe it's the second biggest employer in the world after the Chinese army, right? And it is socialized medicine top to bottom. Now, I've written about this, and I certainly agree that the American system is a nightmare. And this may shock some of the people that follow me, but if I had to choose between the American system and the single-payer system in the UK, just based on results right now and having lived in both, I would prefer the British system, which seems to be more honest apart from anything else. But I've thought about this, and I think there's an argument for having the free market work at the 90% of Medicare, of health issues that aren't catastrophic. So where you would create moral hazard if you were to just have the government pay for it all, but then you socialize the catastrophic, the high risk end of the curve, if you like, right? In Britain, where we haven't done that, where we've socialized it top to bottom, we have massive problems of cost. Not as bad as America, but that's a different discussion. We have huge cost pressures. And we also have this difficulty that it's hard to make good changes that favor health outcomes, because all practical discussions become highly politicized, because the whole thing, all healthcare is a political debate, right? How do you deal with those concerns when you're talking about single payer system?
I really like the idea of socializing the catastrophic conditions. That really is the problem in our system, where a significant proportion of the expenses in the United States are spent on the last year or two of life and various extreme situations. And so that is one change that we could make that would address a significant proportion of the cost issues in the US. And one thing I would say is going to happen in the US that might address some of what you're discussing is that there's going to be some gold-plated private concierge service in parallel to the public option, because it's America, and that Google and the gang, they're going to have some like crazy concierge healthcare service. And so you'll still end up having at least a certain degree of resources and innovation getting plowed into addressing various conditions and procedures over time. So I think the US might, one of the things I know, and one of the misconceptions is that somehow we're going to have to find the money for this. We're already spending 18% of GDP on healthcare. It's incredibly excesses in the system.
Yes.
So at this point, there's almost
economically.
Yeah. At this point, there's almost nothing we could do that would could help, but to bring the cost down relative to what we're doing now.
Now, I know that you are a successful entrepreneur, and you have been, some of the people that have interviewed you, they've heard about your universal basic income idea, and they've tried to slap the label socialist on you, and you deal with that. You explain why that's wrong. But given that, or with that in mind, do you also agree with part of the point that I was making, that if you allow the free market in the non-catastrophic part of healthcare, you get all the benefits of the marketplace operating just like the benefits that operate, for people buying food and groceries, right? You wouldn't want to have socialized food, even though it's just as essential as healthcare, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is, you're not being a socialist. Does that not make you favor the operations of the market in healthcare, which is a hugely important domain in everybody's lives, where they can be effective?
Yeah, so I like, for example, having patients have some kind of skin in the game, some cost, so that like when you utilize services, that like it's not like a zero cost, which ends up but potentially having you use and consume services you didn't really need, because you're just like, hey, I'm just going to do
Which is what happens in the UK, definitely.
Yeah, so I think having some market-based mechanism on that side is very, very useful and helpful. I do think, though, that healthcare is a distinct market where having some cost associated with it is a plus and helps introduce market efficiency. But health is just a different thing where, like, when you get sick, you're not necessarily going to operate as like an efficient economic actor in all things. You're just going to be like, what is going to make me better? It's like, whatever it is, like, we have to. And so in many cases, it's just something that would benefit from certain market mechanisms, but it's very, very dissimilar from most other consumer markets in fundamental ways.
Okay. Well, that's, yeah, true enough. Okay. So, going back then to the universal basic income, the Freedom Dividend, which you want to set at $1,000 a month, right?
Yes.
I know that you've made the point that a lot of conservatives, they're obviously driven by reducing the desire to reduce government interference in their lives. And by having a no strings attached, no questions asked dividend, $1,000 a month, you can, in principle, eliminate a lot of government interference and judgment that comes with the welfare state and a multitude of programs. How does the UBI or the Freedom Dividend specifically, how would it enable us to do that? Like, what would the conservatives get? What would the libertarians get in terms of eliminated programs and eliminated intrusion by the state?
So libertarians love this plan in part because it's been championed by Milton Friedman, who's a patron saint of conservative economists. So what libertarians and conservatives hate is government bureaucracy making everyone's decisions. What they like is economic freedom and autonomy. And so if everyone's getting $1,000 a month, then that lightens the bureaucracy over time. And it also creates much better incentives, because if I get this dividend regardless, if I do better, I get to keep it. But I don't have some disincentive to work. I don't have some disincentive to improve my station. And over time, you would see a shrinkage among the enrollments of traditional welfare programs, because there'd be more people that would prefer the $1,000 cash. And I would suggest that virtually no one is in love with the 126 welfare programs that exist in the United States. I mean, it's a whole hodgepodge patchwork. And there are some very perverse incentives attached to many of them, where if it's like there's a friend's sister on disability who said that she couldn't volunteer for a nonprofit because she was afraid that she'd lose her disability benefits. So she just like stays at home. And I would suggest that's a loser for everybody. I mean, obviously she should be volunteering if that's something that she feels she can do. So for conservatives, it's the thing that I think frustrates the heck out of most conservatives is this thought that the government is just going to take in more money. It's just going to disappear into the pipes, into the bureaucracy. Whereas in this case, if the money's going into your hands, then you think like, wow, this is like the best thing the government's actually ever done, because it was my money anyway. And it was your money anyway. You are correct about that. That's the reason why Alaska has been the one state to implement this in the U.S. And it was a Republican governor in a deep red state that made it happen. So there are very, very powerful conservative ideas behind this.
How could you legislate it in such a way that you could say to the American people, here's $1,000 a month. I'm going to let you spend this $1,000 a month rather than the government spend it for you. If you were to introduce it that way, how could you introduce it, to implement the Freedom Dividend at the same time that you remove, the government's ability to spend that money on your behalf? Because I get that you can make the choice, right? You could give someone on welfare the choice. But if you were going to make it a political slam dunk, you'd need to give the conservatives or the libertarians, okay, yeah, we're going to change who spends the money rather than spend more money.
I really like that. That's good thinking. It's certainly the case that, right now, if you're a conservative or libertarian, you're like, well, in this new world, I get $1,000 a month. And in the old world, what am I getting from the government that I can actually rely upon? It's like, well, in theory, I'm getting all these security benefits and it's like the legal protections and regimes and fire protection, all this other stuff. But I'm sure most libertarians would prefer the cash. And so it's not that that I believe most people would regard this as a significant improvement from the current government allocation.
Yeah, I mean, I would be really interested if, I don't know if you, I guess you have folks who do policy, you have like maybe a legislative advisor or director there, how that could be formulated so that, you're not just, here's the thing you're getting, but here's the thing that's being taken away from the government departments that are inefficiently spending it badly for you. I'd love to see how.
Yeah, no, and I do want to lighten up a lot of the inefficiencies in government. I mean, everyone in America knows that we have a lot of excesses in our government bureaucracy at this point.
Yeah, no, sure. Okay, so let's talk about talk a bit about government spending. The flip side of that coin, government revenue. Let's talk about taxation, because I know you've got an interesting point to make about getting some of, let's say, big tech to pay, as I guess you would call it, their fair share into our society. So talk a little bit about that. And then I also want to ask you, can we not apply the same principle to the extremely privileged domain of finance, corporate finance, the big banks, where there are actual legal privileges that these folks get to exercise to do things with money that if you or I did them would be criminal, but basically guarantee a transfer of value to people that don't make anything, but just financialize things?
Yeah, so my idea to finance the dividend is to have a value-added tax that would fall on the Amazons and Googles of the world. And you probably saw the headlines that Amazon paid zero in federal taxes in 2018 despite record profits. And that's not Amazon's fault, that's our fault. If we have a system that they can game their way out of that easily, maybe we should upgrade our system. So the value-added tax would get us billions, tens of billions of dollars from the Amazons of the world. And it would put us in position to hopefully, again, spread that bounty to ordinary citizens. And the value-added tax would also rein in some of the excesses in the financial institutions. The financial institutions have definitely co-opted our economy in many ways. But the thing we have to escape is this zero-sum game thinking, because in many ways, again, I feel like it's our fault, where like if you have this system and then these people game the heck out of it, again, that's our fault, not theirs. I mean, we just need to do a better job of harvesting the gains from these activities to the public.
And what do you think about the Tobin tax?
Could you clarify?
The Tobin tax, the idea of where you've got financial transactions, purely financial transactions, very large sums. So basically financial speculation, maybe kind of currency speculation, things like that, where there's billions, tens, hundreds of billions, top line changing hands and being traded. And the margins are small for the banks that are doing it, but the profits are huge. And the Tobin tax takes a tiny sliver of each transaction. So where you've got also algorithmic stock trading, for example.
Yeah. I'm a fan of taxes that help harvest the gains from all of these computer algorithmic trading mechanisms that you're taking like a fraction of a penny and then you do it like a billion times. Because what real economic value is getting generated there? Really nothing. You're just sort of like extracting some revenue out of the system. Same thing with like firms that are literally investing in having faster connections and pipes to the trading floors, where it's like, oh, if I get in there and just have like the fastest signal, then I can front run my competitors by like a hundredth of a second. And that hundredth of a second is worth millions of dollars. And then that's your business. I mean, like, who does that help? And so I'm for a Tobin tax type toll on speculation that really has nothing but financial motivations.
Okay, so between the VAT and maybe a tax like the Tobin tax, do you see this as having a positive impact on government revenue? Are you actually trying to raise more money? Or are we going to see offsetting benefits? So, for example, I particularly hate the payroll tax, just kind of on principle.
No, the payroll tax in a way does not make any sense, because we should not be trying to discourage any type of labor or labor type arrangement.
So you would be looking to more comprehensively maybe reform our tax system. So if we maybe
ideally,
our VAT, our value-added tax, but we can drop some of the others.
Yeah, I would be in favor of that sort of reform and trade over time. So there are things like the U.S. we need to do everything in our power. So we need to spend more effectively. We need to generate revenue more effectively. We need to become more efficient in various ways. I mean, at this point, we have this legacy kludgy system that is, on the verge of, frankly, just like driving us into the ground. And you have to attack it from every angle.
Yeah, oh, fair enough. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let me change gears a little bit. I haven't seen, I'm sure you have been asked about this, but I haven't found it if you have yet. I'm rather concerned at what seems to be something of a takeover of what I call the cultural commanding heights. So the education, the campuses, and the media by identitarians, especially on the left, people engaged in identity politics, but not exclusively on the left at all. But I'm seeing that, and as someone that kind of cares about the founding principles, free speech, and I'm very much more committed to truth than to tribe. And that's one thing I like about you. You seem to start with the way the world is rather than your ideological box, as I mentioned earlier. Do you see cause for concern there with identity politics and the cultural commanding heights? And if so, what do you do about it?
I think that my goal is to try and get people focused on actionable solutions. And so one of the things I suggest is what $1,000 a month would do? It would help millions of American women who are in exploitative or abusive jobs and relationships. And what's going to make a bigger difference to a set of people, economic resources or something else? And then get people focused on the numbers and the reality and the economics. Because if you purport to be for certain social goals, if we can bring you in and say, look, there are more effective ways to reach those goals, and that should be a win. So I'm with you in terms of a pursuit of truth and impact and real solutions. And I'm more of a numbers guy than a feelings guy. Like, I think the numbers drive the feelings over time. And so we need to get the numbers right. And then we'll have more of a luxury to be able to address some other things.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of press a little bit on this though. There is a well-documented lack of intellectual diversity in education in the United States now, beyond anything we've seen in history. So, for example, it's very hard to see self-identified conservatives or even libertarians in a lot of disciplines. So anything that's kind of social psychology, for example, but history. Any of the literary disciplines. Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're basically culturally liberal, right? I think we have that in common. You like diversity. I mean, I'm talking here to an Asian man with Taiwanese background, right? There are certain kinds of diversity that as a society we're rightly concerned with, but it seems that intellectual diversity, as that disappears, we stop being able to deal unbiasedly, effectively with the numbers, with the data, and we end up kind of, coming off the tracks. That's my fear. What do you say to that? What do you think about that?
I think that intellectual diversity is a very positive thing in just about any setting, particularly a setting that's meant to shape the ideas of others. That, if you have a culture that promulgates really just like a single approach to the world, over time, that's not going to be as productive or constructive for the people that you're meant to equip and train. So, it's like, so I think your concern about this is something that more and more people share. And it's certainly something that I think that many of these institutions should be attentive to.
So maybe it would be fair to say that you want to begin to solve this by example, by not behaving or speaking in that way.
What I say is like, I approach things the way I most naturally approach them. And, but the goal is to lead by example. And I will say there's a massive appetite for this kind of discussion and approach and solutions. And we can go very, very far. I don't know if you saw this report called Hidden Tribes that came out a number of months ago, but it indicates that many people have a very similar perspective to the one you just shared.
Yeah, no, I believe that's true. And this is actually, in a way, my cause for optimism. I think kind of the extremist ideological, even identitarian pendulum has kind of swung as far as it will go, more or less. I don't know if we're at the exact maximum. And what we're seeing now is folks like you, organizations like More in Common, Better Angels, Purple America. There's lots of organizations that are now the seeds of the reaction, you might say, to a better way of conducting discourse, of judging ideas without judging people, all of that kind of thing.
I agree. We've come up with a nickname for this campaign. It's the Revolution of Reason. I think the revolution can go very, very far.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, here's hoping. Now, I mentioned your Taiwanese parentage, right? Both your parents are from Taiwan. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
How old were you when? Oh, you were born in the United States, though, right?
Yeah.
How long before you were born did your parents come to the US?
Well, they met in the mid-'60s, late 60s at Berkeley, where they were both graduate students. Then they had my brother in 1972 in San Francisco.
Okay.
And then they moved to Schenectady, New York, and I was born in 75. So they were probably together for approximately 6 or 7 years by the time I was born. And
I'm guessing that you're a fluent Mandarin speaker.
I'm the black sheep of the family. I kept getting left back in Chinese school, so my Chinese is quite poor.
Mama.
Yeah, it's pretty high.
Enough said. Okay, so this is all a bit of an intro to something I'm really interested to ask you about. It seems to me that one of the biggest geopolitical issues that if we don't get right might make all other discussions somewhat moot is the rise of China. The sleeping dragon is no longer sleeping. And another reason why it was fun for me to speak to you is that I've actually lived in Taiwan for a couple of years. And I find that a lot of Westerners who live in Taiwan, they really get sometimes more passionate about Taiwanese independence or their right to self-determination, let's put it that way, than a lot of Taiwanese. What is your take on, I'm actually interested. What do you think should be Taiwan's future? What do you feel about the way it should try and go? I guess if you were there, would you be voting for the DPP or the KMT? And how do we deal in principle with the rise of China that now seems to be becoming so Orwellian with its what do they call it? Social credit system. I mean, it's terrifying to me as kind of a freeborn Westerner in quotes. How do you feel about that as someone with Chinese heritage?
Well, I agree with you that it's one of the most important relationships to navigate over time, and that I think right now the U.S. has a tendency to view things as a zero-sum game where if China rises, then we're somehow falling, and it leads to an increase in tensions. So that's what I think we need to try and forestall and avoid, because it's impossible to manage the rise of AI and climate change and various geopolitical hotspots like North Korea without some sort of strong ties to China. It's just not going to happen. So one of the goals of my presidency will be to try and build a more positive, non-zero-sum relationship with China, and that includes hopefully maintaining the current situation for many people in the Asian continent.
So would you support on principle the one China policy?
Well, I think the one China policy is very deeply ingrained into Chinese culture and heritage. And I think that right now, the way things are functioning, to me, is one of the better outcomes one could hope for people in Greater China generally. And so to me, anything that upsets the status quo would be something that I would be deeply concerned about. But right now, I think things are going fairly well, at least on that level.
As a kind of a cultural liberal, does there not become a point where you have to say that you can't stand by as a nation like China takes control of the lives of its people? I mean, now stopping people travel because they don't have enough social credit points, a lot of that's politically motivated. I mean, we're looking potentially at the submergence of a free democracy within what you might think I'm overstating it, but seems quite an increasingly Orwellian state. I'm terrified by that. Are you not?
I think that your concerns have like a basis in your own experiences and like in reality. So it is the case that the Chinese government is engaging in practices that, as a freeborn Westerner, like you or I might not be excited about. The danger, though, to me, is to adopt, frankly, like an American lens towards what many other societies are doing. Because to me, that's what led us into conflicts in Asia over the last century, where we got ourselves convinced that if South Vietnam or South Korea were to go a certain direction, it would be disastrous for democracy writ large. And then we wound up in multi-year, multi-decade conflicts that may or may not have achieved like their original goals. So to me, like the focus of the United States, for better or for worse, needs to be to try and restore itself at home, because we are falling apart again, like dwindling life expectancy. Our political cohesion is at like multi-decade lows at least. We are not doing well. If we were doing well, Donald Trump would not be our president. And so if you're the leader of a country and it's not doing well, then you know what your job is. And your job is to try and restore a higher degree of functionality to your own society.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else that I've not touched on that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so one of the big themes of my campaign, I think that you've seen this and shared this, is that we really need to evolve and advance as a people, because right now we have this approach of capital efficiency to our own human value. It's why we talk about trying to retrain coal miners as coders and other things. It's like, oh, well, human worth is determined by the marketplace. So if the marketplace wants coders, I guess that's what we're going to try and turn you into, even though that's more of a fantasy than a reality in most cases. So the single biggest theme of the campaign is that we need to start seeing ourselves as having intrinsic value, like as human beings, and try and make this economic system work for us instead of us all being inputs into the system. Because if we're all inputs into the system, we will lose on an epic historic scale. We will not be able to outcompete artificial intelligence, robots, and software, where the marginal cost of an activity is zero or near zero. We can't win. And so we have to actually change the rules of the game, change the rules of the economy to something that we can actually succeed at, even as the goalposts are moving very, very quickly. And that's something that I'm sure is vital to the health of our society moving forward. And for whatever reason, it's something that most other political leaders haven't been able to get their arms around. And so that's what I'd love to leave people with, is the sense that, look, if we do not evolve, we are going to tear ourselves apart. We're all going to lose on a scale that's historic. And you can already see it in the numbers and in the nature of what's happening in the United States of America. And I believe, as you and I talked about earlier in this conversation, Robin, that the appetite is now there, that like people have woken up to the fact that our institutions are not doing well, and that our old approaches aren't going to work, and that we need to revive ourselves to the challenges of the 21st century.
In the unlikely event that you don't become our next president, then
I know, so unlikely.
Would you consider running for Congress or any other office whereby you have a platform to basically do what you're doing? I mean, it also occurs to me that, we talked about the evolving role of the presidency, for good or for ill, but most of what you're talking about is legislative, of course. The executive doesn't pass legislation, it just executes it. It would seem that someone of your ilk and your interest would be well placed in Congress, let's say, or in the Senate. Would you consider that?
Like, I'm open to any role that I think helps move society forward. I mean, I'm first and foremost a parent and a patriot, and if I think I can move the needle in any capacity, I would take a long, hard look at it. I'm certainly not some narcissist who's been dreaming about being president forever. I don't care so much about the labels and seating charts. I just want to try and solve problems. And if that's one way I could do it, then I'd be very, very open to looking at it.
What are some of the most memorable reactions that you've received on the campaign trail? Last interview I saw, you said you'd been to Iowa 5 times, might be more by now. What's your feeling, to pick up on what you said about people being ready, which I kind of agree with, yeah. Specifically, can you give us some examples that have kind of touched you maybe a little more than others, maybe a bit personally?
I've been blown away by the response I've gotten in communities around the country, where you think, and you'll look at me, it's like I'm like the urban Asian guy, like showing up. But most of the time, people realize that you're there to help, that there's no other reason that you'd be there, and they're really touched. They're touched that you're trying to improve their lives, and that in turn inspires you. And that's happened to me now dozens, maybe hundreds of times on the trail. So I've been to Iowa 8 times. I'm going back for a 9th time next week.
Wow. Quite a few, yeah.
Yeah, and the American people are really good. You know, it's like that. It breaks your heart what the heck has happened to our country. But the recognition that we need to take on a new approach is growing stronger every day.
And do you find that your being a young Asian man affects anything in your conversations with the Americans, especially in Iowa? I guess it's a pretty white area where you're going, to in Iowa.
The main impact is that people assume I know what I'm talking about when I talk about technology. It's like, it's like that guy looks like he knows what he's talking about. So if anything, it's been like a positive.
I get a free 4 IQ points when I give speeches with this accent. So maybe you get some credibility points.
I need to be both an Asian guy and have a British accent.
Maybe I should run as your VP. Have you got a VP chosen yet?
I do not. And then the benefit would be even higher. And then maybe for a 3rd step, I could wear glasses. There are all sorts of possibilities.
I love it. Andrew, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you for coming on to this show, doing this with me. I'm sure if you're willing, I would love to talk to you again at some point and, maybe ask some of the same questions, but also some different ones. And I wish you luck, not just in your campaign, but in getting the values that underpin your campaign, this productive discourse, this fact-based discourse, just into the American conversation. So thanks for
thank you, Robin. I enjoyed this conversation a great deal, and I'm sure we'll talk again as this campaign makes progress. It's going to be quite a journey, and I hope you and I get to meet in person even.
Yeah, well, I hope to meet you one day. So, so come up here to Seattle if you haven't already. They'd love you up here.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to come to Seattle at some point. So I'll see you then.
All right, you got it. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Robin.
Have a good evening.
Appreciate it.